Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the 300-year story of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, this was a complex and, frankly, powerful empire that didn't just rule. It fundamentally reshaped the course of Indian history, laying the very groundwork for the nation we know today. Okay, so let's jump right in. To really get our bearings, you gotta know that the Sultanate wasn't just one single thing. Nope, it was actually a series of 5 distinct dynasties, one after the other. It all started with the Mamluks and wrapped up 3 centuries later with the Lodis. Just think of this timeline as our roadmap for the journey we're about to take. And that really brings us to the big question, the one that's going to drive this whole explainer. It's not just about what the Sultanate was, it's about what it did. How did its innovations, its conflicts, and its whole culture create a foundation that future empires, and yeah, even modern India, would end up building on? All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with its super unlikely beginnings, then we'll chart its explosive growth, check out the wild experiments that led to its downfall, follow its slow decline, and finally, really dig into the profound legacy it left behind. So, how in the world did this whole thing get started? Well, the story doesn't begin with princes born to rule. It kicks off with Turkish slave generals who saw their chance and grabbed it, forging a brand new state right on Indian soil. You see, to get why the Sultanate was so different, you have to look at the 2 big Turkish invasions that came before it. First, you had Mahmud of Ghazni. He was basically a raider, all about looting temples and hauling wealth back home. But then came Muhammad Ghori. He had a totally different vision. He didn't just come to conquer, he came to stay and to rule. And here is the crucial moment. After Ghori's death, his successors made a very deliberate choice. Sultan Iltutmish formally cut all political ties with the powers back in Central Asia. This was a huge deal. It meant the new Delhi Sultanate would grow as its own uniquely Indian state, not just some satellite of a foreign empire. Now, you've got this huge new territory. How do you govern it? Well, they came up with a pretty clever system called the Iqta. It was kind of like an administrative hack. Instead of paying officials cash, which was complicated, the Sultan gave them the rights to collect taxes from a piece of land, an Iqta. The catch? In return, that official had to maintain a whole bunch of troops, ready to fight whenever the Sultan called. But controlling land is one thing. Controlling your powerful, ambitious nobles, that's a whole different ballgame. Sultan Balban had a solution for that. He basically elevated the king to divine status. He declared himself the Zil-e-Ilahi, the shadow of God on earth. He wasn't just being arrogant. He was building this powerful idea of absolute, unquestionable authority. And all that groundwork? Well, it paid off big time. It allowed the next dynasty, the Khaljis, to push the empire to the absolute height of its power. This was the Sultanate's golden age, and also its most ruthless. Under the incredibly ambitious Alauddin Khalji, the map of the empire was literally redrawn. For the first time ever, a power based in Delhi successfully marched its armies way down into southern India, just shattering old boundaries and bringing huge new lands under its control. So, how did he pay for all these massive military campaigns? With a system so radical that people at the time called it one of the great wonders of the world. To keep a giant army on standby, Alauddin basically seized control of the entire economy. He fixed the prices of everything, from grain to horses. It was one of the most audacious experiments in economic control in history. And the sheer scale of his control was just staggering. Get this, Alauddin raised the land tax to 50% of everything a farmer produced. And he had his officials collect it directly. This cut out all the local lords and funneled a mind-boggling amount of wealth straight into the treasury, giving him just incredible power. But as it so often happens, right? A spectacular peak is followed by a sharp, dramatic fall. The next dynasty, the Tughlaqs, was defined by brilliant, grand ambitions that, well, they turned out to be catastrophic failures. Yeah, the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq is a perfect case study in just going too far. First, he orders the entire capital city to pack up and move hundreds of miles south. Then, he introduces a new token currency made of bronze, which people immediately start counterfeiting, crashing the economy. And to top it off, he launches these fantastically expensive invasions that just fizzle out. Every idea was bold, but the execution was a disaster. So this string of terrible policies and the rebellions that followed left the empire dangerously weak.
And, of course, right on cue, a devastating blow comes from the outside. The brutal invasion of Timur, you might know him as Tamerlane, in 1398 didn't just sack Delhi, it absolutely shattered the Tughlaq dynasty's authority for good.
After Timur's invasion, the empire really never got back on its feet. And that brings us to the final phase of the Sultanate, where the last two dynasties, the Sayyids and the Lodis, were basically ruling over a much smaller, broken kingdom. The Lodis, who were Afghan, brought a totally different way of ruling to the table. See, unlike the earlier Turkish sultans who acted like absolute monarchs, the Lodi kings governed more like a first among equals. The sultan would literally share a carpet with his top nobles. It was a kind of tribal equality that was worlds away from the whole shadow of God theory.
But that doesn't mean they'd just given up. Even during this decline, there were still these clever moves to try and get some central control back. Sultan Sikandar Lodi, for example, founded a whole new city, Agra, in 1504. He chose its location specifically to keep a better eye on his nobles and the all-important trade routes in the area. In the end, though, the final collapse came from within. The last sultan, Ibrahim Lodi, he ditched that first among equals approach and tried to completely crush the power of his Afghan nobles. Well, feeling threatened, a group of these nobles did the unthinkable. They sent an invitation to a foreign ruler, a guy named Babur, to come and invade and get rid of their own king. So, the Sultanate is defeated, but what's the big takeaway from this 300-year epic? Well, its influence didn't just disappear in 1526. Not even close. In fact, you could say its legacy is all around us, embedded in the very DNA of the subcontinent. But before we get to the full legacy, let's talk about that final act. The end came at the Battle of Panipat. Babur's smaller army showed up with a game-changing technology, mobile cannons. It was a brutal lesson in how new military tech can just overwhelm old tactics and sheer numbers. And with that, the Delhi Sultanate was officially over. But just look at what they left behind in stone. The Sultanate introduced a completely new architectural language to India. Before them, Indian buildings were mostly trabeate, that's all beams and posts. They brought the arcuate style, defined by those incredible soaring arches and massive domes that would become the signature look of Indo-Islamic architecture for centuries. And here's the most crucial point of all, the Sultanate basically built the scaffolding for the next great empire. The Mughals who came right after didn't start from scratch. Oh no! They inherited a ready-made, centralized state, a sophisticated tax system, a rich court culture, and military structures, all pioneered by the sultans. Which really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The Delhi Sultanate as a political power was destroyed on that battlefield at Panipat. But its ideas about how to run a state, about culture, about architecture, about the very concept of a pan-Indian empire, they didn't just survive. They became the foundation for everything that came next.